The Golden Hills of California, a late-night tale for souls who've known the weight of waiting. Moravia, the town even maps forgot. Moravia is the kind of town you could drive right past without realizing, especially if your hands are steady on the wheel and your mind's drifting with the playlist on the radio. No welcome sign, no chain gas stations, no branded coffee shops. Just a small diner called Golden Spoon, an old white wooden church, and a handful of slanted rooftops leaning into the sun-scorched fields. But when autumn comes, the place glows in a way cities will never understand. The hills, dry and unremarkable for most of the year, suddenly light up, golden with sunburnt grass, shimmering sagebrush, and sunsets that stretch across the ground like a vast, glowing tablecloth. It was here in 2001 that Eli arrived. No one quite knew where he came from, only that he bought the old wooden house from an aging couple heading south. Paid in cash. No haggling. People still remember the first day Eli stepped into town. Not because he did anything strange, but because he was so quiet. In a place where everyone knows everyone else's business. Eli's silence stood out. Some called him the urban hermit. Others said he was running from something. But the more perceptive folks, they saw something in his eyes, like a man looking for something he lost long ago, somewhere between time and sky. The cabin beneath the oak. Eli's cabin sat atop a small hill, cut off from town by a winding dirt road. On the porch there was an old rocking chair. To the left, an ancient stone well, long dry, but still echoing with old whispers. Each morning, Eli would walk to the well, lay his hand on the rim, as if listening for something deep in the earth. Then he'd brew coffee in a dented aluminum pot, read a few pages of a book, grab his camera and notebook and head toward the hills. No one ever saw his photos. No exhibits, no albums, no posts. But he went out every day like it was a ritual. And each evening he'd return, boil water with firewood, write something in his journal, and sit for hours, watching the sun slip behind the hills. Clara, the stranger who brought a different wind. One October afternoon, when the wind carried dust from the plains and the sky looked like an oil painting, a silver Jeep rolled up the dirt road. Clara, a red-haired archaeology student from Berkeley, had been tracing ancient records of a native tribe that once lived in the hills of Moravia centuries ago. She pitched her tent near Eli's cabin after asking for permission. She didn't expect friendliness, just a quiet place to work. But Eli didn't say no. Instead, he asked, "Are you afraid of being alone out here in the hills?" Clara answered without hesitation, "I'm more afraid of being in a crowd and still feeling empty." Eli chuckled, his first laugh in months. The days without names. Clara and Eli became quiet companions. They didn't talk much, but both knew how to exist beside someone without intrusion. One evening, Clara asked, "You used to live in the city, didn't you? Why did you come here?" Eli was silent for a long time. Then he spoke, in a voice like wind over hills. "I once loved someone. She said she'd come back when the hills turned gold. But time doesn't wait for anyone. And I kept waiting here." Clara didn't know what to say, but from that day on, she began keeping a little journal, not just of archaeological notes, but of thoughts on people and memory. When the wind changed, one day Clara left. Before she did, she left a letter on the windowsill. "Eli, you're the only person I've ever met who never stopped believing in a promise. I don't know if she'll ever return, but I believe you've lived each day for something beautiful. Faith. If one day you're no longer here, I'll tell others this story, so they'll know there are hills that remember how to wait." Eli read the letter, folded it gently, and tucked it into his old leather notebook. He kept walking the hills every evening, until one day, the hills one last time. That fall, wildfires crept dangerously close to Moravia. But strangely, the hill where Eli lived remained untouched. When Matteo, the boy from town, now a young man, realized he hadn't seen Eli in days, he hiked up the hill. Matteo found Eli in his rocking chair, eyes gently closed, a faint smile on his lips. He had passed like a breeze without a sound. Beside him was an old photograph. A red-haired woman standing among golden hills, sunlight on her shoulders. No one could say for sure if it was Clara or the woman Eli had waited for. But on the back, in familiar handwriting, were the words, "When the hills turn gold, we'll meet again." The new storytellers. They buried Eli beneath the great oak. From that day on, the tree sprouted green leaves, even though the season was still dry. Matteo tended the place like a living memory. A year later, he received a package from Clara, a book titled, "The Hill Keepers, on Waiting and Unspoken Memories." On the first page was a quote, "There are people the world may never know, but they are the ones who keep the light burning in the quietest part of the human soul." And now, as you listen to this story, in the hush of night, in the ticking of a distant clock or the stillness of silence, imagine a golden California afternoon, hills rolling like frozen waves, and a man sitting still, waiting for the last light to wash the grass in gold. Not everyone understands why people wait. But if you've ever loved someone deeply, ever gone quiet for the sake of a memory, ever held onto a promise for years, then maybe, just maybe, you've been a hill keeper too. The wind returns. Matteo stood still before Eli's grave, beneath the shade of the old oak tree that had just begun to sprout fresh green leaves. He wasn't sure whether it was nature's coincidence or a sign of something deeper, but ever since Eli passed, the tree was no longer bare. It had come back to life, just like a part of Matteo was quietly waking up inside him. The town of Moravia remained the same, quiet, sparse, and never in a rush. But Matteo had changed. He was no longer the boy who used to watch Eli from a distance. He had become the one who told the story, He took over his parents' little grocery shop, and every Saturday night, when the shop lights dimmed, he'd pull a wooden chair onto the porch and begin to tell stories. Not necessarily for anyone. Sometimes just for himself, sometimes for the wind, or for the occasional passerby who wanted to stay a little longer. But gradually more people began to come. Some drove in from Paso Robles, others were lost travelers, and a few were Clara's students. They had read about Maravilla in her book and came looking. Mateo called those nights Golden Hill Stories. A letter from Berkeley. One summer day, Mateo received a letter. Dear Mateo, I just returned from 3 months of excavation in Egypt. Strangely, what I've been thinking about most isn't the desert. It's the hill where Eli once lived. I still remember the night he spoke about the first shooting star he ever photographed, and the way he looked at sunsets like they were a secret language only he could understand. I'll be coming back to Maravilla in the fall. I don't know exactly what I'm looking for. Maybe nothing at all, but I know I need to stand in that place again, where the hills glow like a promise once left behind. Clara. Mateo read the letter in silence. He folded it carefully and placed it next to Eli's old leather journal, which he'd kept ever since Eli passed. His heart stirred, not because of what was written, but because of all that wasn't. Fall again. That fall, the winds came earlier than usual. The dry grass turned golden fast, and the town wore its coat of honeyed amber. Mateo cleared the path up the hill, repaired the old stone steps by the dry well, and placed a new wooden chair beside Eli's grave. On a Friday afternoon, as the sun slanted across the hills, a car pulled up in front of the old cabin. Clara stepped out, her hair still red, but her eyes deeper, quieter. She stood for a long moment, saying nothing, just looking up at the sky, and then began to walk gently uphill. Mateo met her there under the oak tree. No need for many words. They sat side by side like two people who had known each other for ages. Not through time, but through a shared love for something now gone. Clara pulled out a photograph. Not an old one, a new one, taken from above. Golden hills, the wooden cabin, the oak tree, and the long shadows of two people sitting quietly together. I took it with a drone last week, she said. I think if Eli were still here, he'd really like this one. Mateo looked at the photo, then up at the hill, where the wind still passed through, whispering like a familiar voice, still telling stories. The next hillkeeper. Since Clara's return, Maravilla had gained another soul in the hills. She didn't stay in Eli's cabin. She pitched her tent on the western slope, beneath a large cactus bush. Each morning she recorded notes on her research. Each afternoon she walked the stone steps Eli once walked. And in the evenings, she and Mateo would sit and tell stories together. One night, Mateo asked, "Do you think Eli waited for the right person?" Clara looked at him, long and thoughtfully, before answering. "I think Sometimes people aren't waiting for someone specific. They're waiting for a part of themselves, the part that once believed love could survive the wind, the sun, and time. Mateo said nothing. He simply smiled, because in that moment, he knew Clara had taken up Eli's place. She was now the one watching over the hills. And if you ever come to Maravilla in the fall, if you happen to drive through California and decide to turn down a nameless dirt road, you just might find yourself in Maravilla. You'll see a small grocery store with a sign that reads, Mateo's Golden Hill Stories, told every Saturday night. You can stay a while, order a cup of mint tea, and if you're lucky, you might hear a story that never made it into any book, about the man who waited, the woman who returned, and the hills that change colors each year to keep a promise. And if you ask for the way up the hill, Mateo will point you to a faded trail and say, just follow the gold. It'll take you where you need to go, where people once waited in silence for each other. A winter without snow. California doesn't get snow like Vermont or Oregon, but in Maravilla, winter arrives in its own way. The wind grows colder, the sun sets earlier, and the old oak tree on the hill starts shedding its leaves. Dry leaves tumble down the weathered stone steps, making a soft sound, like someone walking gently through memories. Clara was still there. She rented Eli's old cabin but didn't renovate much, just tidied it up, keeping the old belongings intact, like a living museum. Every morning, she brewed tea in a dented aluminum kettle, wrote in her notebook, then wandered the rolling hills, listening to the land whisper its stories. Mateo brought food up every Friday evening. They never called it a date, just dinner under the hill, as they liked to joke. And in that stillness, something quietly took root. Not loud or dramatic, but like seedlings breaking through the soil after a night rain. Have you ever thought about staying here for good? Mateo asked one evening as they sat beneath the oak tree, mist curling in the air around them. Maybe, Clara said, if I can find enough reasons to stay. A person, a feeling, or just a dream I haven't lived fully yet. Then let me be one of those reasons, Mateo said softly. Clara turned to him. That look in her eyes, Eli once had it too, when he gazed toward the sunset. No more words were needed. The dream beneath red earth. In January, when the first rain of the season swept through Maravilla, Clara found something buried in the northern slope. A shard of black pottery etched with symbols of the ancient Chumash people. Nearby, a sharpening stone and a quartz blade. She called Mateo, and together they marked the site with quiet care. Clara spent many nights researching, cross-referencing, and scribbling notes. Then one evening, she rushed into the general store with a map in one hand and tears in her eyes. They lived here, right where Eli used to stand, and this might be one of the oldest ceremonial sites in the region. Mateo stood in stunned silence. Eli used to talk about sounds from the earth, Maybe it wasn't a metaphor. Maybe he really heard them. They didn't make a public announcement. They quietly filed reports, preserved the site, and sent a paper to UC Berkeley. Clara said, "Not everything ancient needs to be displayed. Some things should stay right where they belong, with the land." Season of falling seeds. Spring arrived early in Moravia. Wildflowers burst open among the leftover golden grass. Matteo and Clara planted a small garden behind Eli's cabin. Not vegetables, but native plants. Sagebrush, yarrow, and bright yellow poppies. Matteo began to write. He opened Eli's old notebook and added his own lines beneath each entry. Small stories about the hill, about those who came and went, about glances quietly exchanged under the oak tree. One day, Clara brought home a small wooden statue. A woman standing in the wind, hair flying, arms open as if embracing the whole hillside. She carved a line at the base. "For those who know how to wait." They placed it under the oak, near Eli's grave. And strangely, from that day on, more people began visiting Moravia. Not typical tourists, but the kind who hear the wind speaking, as Clara said. They came, sat quietly under the hill, then left with contemplative faces, as if carrying home something newly healed. The hill keepers, reimagined. Matteo and Clara never called themselves the hill keepers, but the town understood. Whenever something needed holding, a letter that couldn't be mailed, an old photo, a forgotten bracelet, people brought it to the hill. Matteo and Clara didn't ask for stories. They simply kept things safe, as if Moravia were the last place where memories could remain unlost. One night, Matteo wrote the final line in Eli's old notebook. Eli thought he was the one waiting, but really, he was the one who kept the flame alive, for all the beautiful things people stopped believing in. And below that, Clara added, "And we're just the ones carrying on that light. If one day you're lost, if one day you find yourself drifting between nameless cities, fractured memories, and unfinished pieces of love, find your way to Moravia. No map needed. Just follow the old trails, the sun-scorched golden fields, and the silent tilt of the setting sun. When you arrive, stop beneath the old oak. You'll see a wooden cabin, a small statue, and sometimes a man and a woman sitting together, telling stories not with microphones or speakers, but with the warm voice of memory. And if you ask, did people really wait for each other here? They'll just nod and smile, as if you finally understood the most important thing in life, that some loves don't need names, some promises don't need repeating, and some hills stay golden every autumn, like a sign that never forgets. The woman with the green silk scarf. It was a Wednesday afternoon at the end of March. Clara was sweeping the yard behind the cabin when she noticed an old ivory-colored car pulling up to the trail leading up the hill. A woman, perhaps in her early 50s, stepped out. She wore a long wool coat, carrying a small suitcase, and around her neck was a vivid green silk scarf, the color of the deep sea or a long-forgotten dream. She didn't ask for directions, nor did she call anyone. She simply looked toward the hill, then slowly began walking up, as if she had been there before, or perhaps had seen it in some distant dream. Clara didn't interfere. She followed from a distance, quietly, just as Eli once did. The woman stopped under the oak tree, pulled a small journal from her suitcase, sat on the stone bench beside Eli's grave, and began to read. Clara couldn't hear clearly, but the voice was low, steady, and full of tears. When Clara got closer, the woman looked up and said, "I wrote to him starting in 1983. I never sent them. Every autumn I wrote a letter, as if he were still here. And now I think, he is still here, isn't he?" Clara nodded. The woman handed her the journal. "Can you keep it? I think the words inside belong here. I've held onto them for too long." She left immediately. No name, no request for a photo. Just the journal with dozens of letters signed L. Each beginning with "Dur Eli" and ending with "Can you hear the wind? I'm still waiting for the answer." Matteo closed the journal and gently placed it on the wooden shelf in Eli's old room. Clara affixed a small label, "A love that was never sent. The blonde boy and the old camera." On a foggy weekend day, a boy of about 12 came to Maravilla with his father. They were city folk, easy to tell by their mannerisms and speech. But the boy was different. From the moment they stepped into the town, he was curious. Not about the shops or restaurants, but about the hill. He kept staring at the oak tree, then asked Matteo, "Is it true there was an old man up there who knew how to talk to the sun?" Matteo was a bit surprised. The boy explained, "My grandfather used to tell me. He said when he was young, he passed through here, and an old man with a white beard showed him where the sun set and said, 'Every evening, the light will tell us whether today was a sad day or a happy day.'" Clara looked at Matteo, and together they led the boy up the hill. There, the boy pulled an old analog camera from his backpack, a film camera with a scratched lens, but still sturdy. "My grandfather left it for me. I want to take a photo of the place where the light speaks." Clara showed him the angle Eli used to choose, the spot of the stone bench, the moment when the sunlight tilted just right. The boy took 3 pictures, then stood still for a long time. When he turned around, he said, "I think today is a happy day, because the light smiled." The man who smelled of pine wood. He came in the summer. Messy brown hair, scratched hands. Wearing a thick jacket that smelled of pine wood, as if he had just stepped out of a deep forest. He didn't ask to rent a room or look for a gas station. He simply asked, "Is there anywhere here without cell phone service?" Matteo led him up the hill. There, the signal was so weak that even the clocks couldn't update. The man stayed for 3 days. At first, he only sat reading books. Then he began carving wood. On the third day he made a small box, placed it beneath the oak tree and wrote on it, "A place to leave things you no longer need." From then on, the box was always full of strange things. A receipt soaked with tear stains, a key with no known door, a broken ring, a scrap of paper with just 3 words, "Please forgive me." The man left quietly, but the wooden box stayed, and to this day it has never been empty. And those who still come. Moravia has no flashy signs, no luxury hotels. But those who seek the golden hills always bring with them an untold story, a pain never touched, and a fragile belief that, perhaps, somewhere in the world, there's still room for things that can't be explained. Clara and Matteo kept each of these fragments like a museum with no walls, no doors. A town that lives on the wind and whispers. And every Saturday evening, under the yellow light, Matteo would open a new notebook and write another chapter. The Man Who Sought the Lost Photographs. One twilight evening, as the crimson sunset light stretched across the hills, a middle-aged man appeared in the town. He looked tired, but his eyes were full of determination. He carried an old cloth bag, inside of which were thin photo albums, carefully flipping through them. When he saw Clara, he walked up and asked, "Do you know of someone named Samuel Fisher?" Clara furrowed her brow. The name sounded familiar, but she wasn't sure. She replied gently, "We don't know him, but perhaps we can help. What are you looking for?" The man looked into Clara's eyes, hesitating slightly before responding. "I'm his grandson." Samuel Fisher was a photographer. He took many pictures of Moravia almost 40 years ago. After he passed away, all those photographs disappeared. I believe they might still be here, in this place. Clara led him up the hill, where the simple wooden houses always carried a sense of mystery. Over the weekend, they began their search, from the corners of the town, places where memories could sometimes linger for a long time. The first time he looked at Eli's cabinet, his face lit up a little. Old, faded photos began to reveal a few familiar images. Townsfolk, snow-covered hills, some landscapes that seemed to have vanished with the flow of time. "Here it is," the man exclaimed, pulling out a photo of Samuel Fisher, in which a boy stood in the middle of the hill, the pale golden light reflecting from afar. "This is his photo. He always spoke of such beautiful afternoons. Moravia has changed a lot, but I believe those photos are still somewhere here." Clara and the man expanded their search, and on the third day, they discovered a small wooden box at the foot of an oak tree. Inside were old photo albums, each containing images that captured the past of Moravia, old houses, people whom many in the town had forgotten. The man smiled, gently brushing his fingers over each photo, as if touching his own memories. "Thank you, Clara. My grandfather used to say, only when the photographs are found will the stories truly begin." The woman who sought her old dream. A month later, on a quiet morning, a young woman wearing a light blue dress stopped by Maravilla. She looked through the window of the general store, then entered with a thoughtful expression, as though something deep inside her was searching. Clara recognized her immediately. She had seen this woman in an old painting hanging in Eli's house, a painting of a young girl standing in a field of irises, sunlight streaming from the late afternoon. The woman didn't find anything in the store. She simply walked up to Clara and gently asked, "I'd like to ask about someone named Olivia. She lived here before I left." Clara stood still for a moment, then replied, "She's been gone for a long time, but if you want, we can try to find her memories here." The woman sighed, gazing up at the hill, and said, "I left this place a long time ago, but I could never forget it. I thought that perhaps if I came back, I might find something that remains. Part of my dream was lost when I left." Clara accompanied the woman up the hill, and for the first time, Clara noticed a clear change on the woman's face. She was no longer immersed in sadness, but it seemed like some light was beginning to shine in her eyes. They arrived at the large oak tree, where old stories were kept secret. And when the woman removed her old silver bracelet and placed it on the ground, she spoke. "I once thought I would never return, but now I know. Perhaps there is still time to fix the mistakes I made." Clara quietly sat beside the woman, letting time speak for the things that needed to be said. The man who brought the endings of stories. On a late afternoon, as autumn neared its end, an elderly man traveled down from the north. He came to Maravilla not in search of anything, but simply to say goodbye. His steps were steady yet sure, as though he had walked through every corner of the town 1,000 times. Clara recognized him immediately, the man who had brought the books about Maravilla the previous winter, the one who told strange tales of the town to the tourists who had visited. He sat down at Clara's table, took a cup of hot tea, and said, "I've told you everything I know about this town, Clara. Everything I could write with my pen, all the memories I have. But there's one thing I haven't said. It's time for me to go. Maravilla will live on, but I can't stay any longer." Clara smiled and replied, "This town has always lived through its stories. You don't need to stay to see it. Your stories will live on in every corner of Maravilla." The man nodded, stood up, and walked toward the trail leading out of the town. But before he left, he turned once more, looking toward the hill. "I'll always remember this place. Maravilla will forever be a part of my story." And so, Maravilla continued to witness stories, meetings, and farewells. Each person who came, each person who left, carried with them their own unique memories, but all of them found each other at one single point of intersection, beneath the golden hills. The death of the painter and the paintings left behind. On a foggy morning, the town of Maravilla welcomed a special visitor. He was a famous painter, known for creating masterpieces of fields of irises, distant mountain ranges, and simple wooden houses. He came to Moravia for a reason that no one in the town knew, except for Clara. He was an elderly man, with gray hair and a face full of wrinkles from the passage of time. But what made him different was his eyes, still bright and full of creative desire, despite being near the end of his life. The painter didn't speak much, but his gaze was always searching, as if he were looking for something long lost. Clara remembered the first time she met him, when he walked into the town's small cafe, looked around, and asked, "Is this the place where people come seeking peace?" Clara simply smiled and led him to a table by the window, where he could look out at the hills and the fields of flowers. No one knew much about him except that he had lived in big cities, worked as a painter, and had a past full of famous paintings. But why he came to Moravia, a remote town, no one knew. A week later, the painter finished his first painting of Moravia. It was a picture of an old wooden house under the sunset, with golden hills in the distance. The painting was not just a scene but the life of the town itself, as if the painting could tell a story if someone looked at it long enough. "I don't know why I painted this house," he told Clara, "but I felt I had to. There's something here that I can't leave behind." Day by day he painted more pictures, each one revealing a new perspective of Moravia. The land, the hills, the stone benches beneath oak trees, and the old roads. But then, on a fall morning, when the golden leaves had fallen thick on the ground, the painter did not come to the cafe. Clara grew worried and decided to visit him at the small house he rented in the town. When Clara knocked on the door, there was no answer. She entered and found him in his studio, sitting silently in front of his last painting. On the table was a piece of paper with his final words. "There are things we cannot paint, but we must still find a way to express them." His final painting was a scene of the dark sky, with a stone bench under the golden moonlight. Beneath the bench lay an old book, seemingly forgotten long ago. It was as if a sign that everything could return, even if just in memory. Clara placed her hand on the painting, feeling the breath of the past that the painter had imbued within it. Though he had gone, the paintings he left behind would continue to live in Moravia, like memories that would never fade. The children of Moravia. Time passed and another spring arrived. Moravia began to witness small but noticeable changes. The children of the town, Clara and Matteo's children, began to grow. They had bright eyes and unending questions about the world around them. Clara and Matteo were no longer just the keepers of the town's memories. They were now the guides of the new generation. One evening, as the sun began to set, Clara stood by the window, looking out at the hill, where the children were running through the golden grass. Matteo stood beside her, placing his hand on her shoulder, gently whispering, "Perhaps Moravia will never change. And that's the most wonderful thing." Clara smiled softly, looking at the innocent, hopeful faces, and she understood that all the stories of this town would be told again, not just through paintings or journals, but through the small footsteps, the laughter in the breeze, and the long days watching the sun set, a new world being built. Gradually, the story of Maravilla was no longer told just through the people who came and went. The town had become a home, a place for those who found themselves in the quiet moments of the vast world. And then, the next encounters were no longer with people who came and left. They arrived and stayed, to build a new world together, a world not so focused on time, but full of memories. Clara and Mateo decided to open a community house, a place where everyone could find themselves again. The past visitors became companions, and Maravilla, with all its untold stories and unfinished memories, continued to welcome new footsteps. The children of the town would grow, write their own stories, paint new pictures, and Maravilla would always be a place where every memory was cherished, a place where no one had to fear losing anything. The One Who Came After and the Old Traces. On a rainy day, as drops of water fell like broken pieces of crystal, a strange man appeared in Maravilla. He walked alone from the trail leading into the town, wearing a thick coat and a wide-brimmed hat, his gaze seeming to search for something very special. Clara saw him as she was walking through her garden. She felt a strange sensation, something familiar yet unexplainable. As he approached, Clara smiled and greeted him. "Hello, sir. May I help you with something?" The man stopped, looked at Clara for a moment, and then replied, "I'm looking for a place whose name I can't quite remember, but I know it exists here. Is this Maravilla?" Clara nodded, an unexpected sense of curiosity rising in her. This town had never attracted strangers in this way before. Each person who came carried their own story, a reason, a purpose that they kept hidden. "Yes, this is Maravilla. But I don't think you've been here before." The man stared into the distance, as though searching in his memory, and then finally sighed. "I'm an archaeologist and I've heard a story. A town where time cannot erase the memories of those who lived there. I think I've been here before, but my memories of it are fading." Clara didn't ask any more questions, only invited him inside for a cup of tea. She felt that this meeting wasn't a coincidence, but rather a part of the chain of events that Maravilla had been receiving for so long. The lost memories and the mystery of Maravilla. As the man, named Henry, stayed in Maravilla for a few days, he began exploring the town. He went to every corner, not searching for any physical trace, but as though he were looking for something invisible. Clara wasn't sure what he was searching for, but gradually, she felt that he wasn't the only one to come to Maravilla with this purpose. One afternoon, as dark clouds gathered and a cold wind blew through the hills, Henry found an old map buried under a large oak tree outside the town. This map wasn't a regular one. The lines on it had faded with time, but there was one strange detail. All the markers on the map led to the same location, the old house of Samuel Fisher, the photographer Clara had met before. It felt as though everything was starting to become clear. Henry couldn't ignore it. He decided to visit the place the next morning. Clara, though not knowing his exact purpose, still felt she had to go with him. She, along with Matteo and their children, set out following the traces of the old map. When they reached Samuel Fisher's house, the space around them seemed to have changed. Everything was still the same, but there was an eerie silence that seemed to envelop the place, as if all memories had been drained from the present. Henry stood still, looking at the broken window of the house, then turned back, his eyes filled with unspoken questions. Is this Moravia not just a town? Are we all part of a bigger story? Clara looked at the house, then toward the hills where the golden slopes still quietly received the last light of the day. An indescribable feeling rose in her. Perhaps Moravia was a place where memories never faded, but simply waited to be rediscovered. The spring of those who perceive time. The following spring, as the people in the town continued their simple lives, the stories of Moravia were still told and retold in every breeze, every hill, every evening. But now, these stories weren't just told by those who came and left. They were told by those who stayed and understood the invisible connection that this town brought. Clara and Matteo continued to run their community house, a place where people came not only to find memories but also to rediscover themselves. Their children, now grown, no longer just looked at the old paintings or listened to the stories passed down by the previous generations. They began writing their own stories, painting new pictures, creating a world that they would leave for the next generation. Moravia, like an eternal land, would forever live in the lines of memories that never fade, a place where people found each other and shared stories with no ending. The closed doors and a journey begins. Time seemed to have no room for haste in Moravia. It was like a slow-flowing river, sometimes moving forward, sometimes pausing to allow the people who lived there to experience all the simple things life had to offer. But, like everything in life, no matter how beautiful, there would always come a time when it would close. One autumn morning, Clara and Matteo stood by the window of their community house, looking out at the golden hills that had begun to turn to the deep red of fall. The leaves fell, like the final moments of a season they had loved. They knew that, no matter what, spring would come, but not everyone could stay forever. Their children had grown now, and they had their own dreams. Clara knew that, like anyone, the children would have to find their way into the world, to explore new stories, new skies, and new mountaintops on their own. One afternoon, when their children stood at the threshold of the community house, Matteo looked at Clara and said, "We've done everything we could, but now it's time for them to write their own story." Clara smiled and gently nodded. She understood that, no matter where they went, Moravia would always be a part of their journey. This town was not a place that could simply be left behind. Moravia would live on in the heart of everyone, no matter how far apart they were. The farewells and the reunions. On the last day before their children left, Clara and Matteo organized a special evening, a small gathering in the garden of the community house. Twinkling lights hung from the trees, wooden chairs were arranged in a circle, and the table was full of simple but comforting food. Everyone who had lived in Moravia was there, those who had found this place, those who had left and returned, and those who still remained. Everyone shared stories, memories from the past, and dreams for the future. The children sat around the table, listening to the old tales they had heard from their parents, grandparents, and those who had lived there before. But now, their eyes were no longer innocent. They were eyes full of longing and curiosity about the world outside Moravia. As the party came to an end, and everyone bid farewell under the warm glow of the lights, Clara felt a strange sensation. Moravia was not a place that could simply be visited and then left. It was a home of memories, of those who stayed and those who were about to leave. But they were all part of a bigger story, of a continuation that no one could fully understand. The eternal journey. The following spring, the doors of the community house closed, and Clara and Matteo left Moravia, leaving the town a new space for others to come and experience. They didn't know exactly where life would take them, but they knew that Moravia would always be a part of them, a part of every step they took, in every breath they took. For the children who had grown up, each one of them would embark on their own separate journeys, but Moravia would always be the beacon that guided them back. The town was not just a place to find peace. It was a place to experience all the powerful emotions that life gave. Love, separation, hope, and loss. And when everyone left, when the town became quieter, Moravia would still be there, silent and steadfast, like the golden hills that never lost the sunlight. Moravia did not need to say goodbye, for it knew that the stories would live on in everyone's heart, and they would all meet again in memories that would never fade. And so, the story of Moravia, the town without time, without haste, but full of stories, memories, and lives, came to a close. But Moravia didn't truly end, for each new story began with the footsteps of those who had come and gone, from the memories passed down through the generations. For Moravia is a part of all of us. No matter how far we go, no matter how many roads we travel, Moravia will always be there, in the old paintings, in the stories told under the moonlight, in the quiet nights by the fire. This story ends, but those who pass through Moravia will always carry it with them, as part of their lives.